We see in verse 10 of this chapter and verse 11 that the statements go on by Ezekiel, this prophet of God. This prophet says again to this ruler of Tyre, calling him a king. And I need to tell you that the word king is also the same word as the word prince in the first verse, if we look to some of the other ancient versions, such as the Peshitta. But here we have it in English. It says, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, take up a lamentation against the king of Tyre, and say to him, thus says the Lord God, you are the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. Now that passage is always thought by many believers in Satan and Christendom to be speaking of Satan, as saying, see, Satan was once perfect in heaven, but he got filled with pride and he rebelled against the Creator, and he got thrown out of heaven when a third of all the angels were cast out with him. Well, how can this subject be full of wisdom, perfect in beauty? Well, this is what's called mythopoetic language. Sure, it's a big 50-cent word, but what it is, it's language that speaks of a subject, such as a king, in very grandiose terms that disconnects him from the common thought of a human being, because this was a real world stage ruler. So he was spoken of with these mythopoetic terms, perfect in beauty. Everything was going great for this king when he was anointed to cover this great land of Tyre and the entire empire which was under his rule. If we look at chapter 31, we hear another proverb that this same guy, this biblical writer, is supposed to speak against the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. In the first verses it says, Son of man, say to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and his multitude. And then in verse 8 it says, the cedars in the garden of God could not hide it. The fir trees were not like its boughs, and the chestnut trees were not like its branches. No tree in the garden of God was like it in beauty, so that all the trees of Eden envied it that were in the garden of God. Over and over, this passage talks about the Pharaoh being a beautiful tree among many trees that were in Eden, the garden of God. So I ask you again, when we're hearing in chapter 28 of Ezekiel about the anointed cherub who is in the garden of God, who is full of wisdom and perfect in beauty in Eden, does that mean the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, was also in the garden of God, and all those other trees that were trying to hide the Pharaoh's beauty? We see that there's someone else who is in the garden of God. The Pharaoh being one of the tallest and most beautiful trees in, guess where? The garden of God in Eden. When we read about this ancient king of Tyre and how he is connected to timbrels and pipes, that these things were prepared for him in the day he was created, we find a very interesting reference to how kings of the ancient Orient were ordained, were anointed. It was with great pomp and ceremony that these kings were brought forth into the public view, and the celebration was grand, and so was the musical accompaniments that went before and during the procession of this king. So it in no way is referencing a satanic being who was the leader of the worship team in heaven, and he got too big for his britches and was cast down. It's talking about a king who actually found himself to be placed in a grand and lofty position. The day he was created was the day he was ordained as a king. The music that went on all about him was fantastic music. Iniquity being found in him does not mean there's a cosmic being called Satan who got pride-filled and rebelled and was cast from heaven. It's again a reference to man, because I must remind you that this entire passage mentions this being to be a king, a prince, references to a man, calls it a man not one time but two times. So we're absolutely dealing with a man here. If a passage that's supposedly about Satan talks about a man at the start and a man in the middle and a man at the end, then the passage is referring to a man, a human being. To be anointed as the cherub that covers is again another strong mythopoetic term to teach us that this king was ordained by someone bigger than him to cover over, take care of a people, a land, an entire empire, and do so in a whole and righteous manner. But apparently this anointed cherub didn't. So, in closing, the anointed cherub is not about Satan. It's about a man, a human king, a human ruler, the ruler of Tyre.